Hi, my name is Madison Thompson. Thank you so much for watching. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Basidiomycota. It is a division of fungi, and this is for Biology 102, Section 4. Okay, so division Basidiomycota. Approximately 37% of all fungi are in this division, and it contains the most well-known mushrooms, rusts, smuts, yeast, and some plant pathogens. They all share one common characteristic, and this is an organ called the basidium. Notice that the name of this division is named after this organ. So the basidium is an organ responsible for reproduction that produces haploid or diploid, in the case of the specific organism, protrusions off of the main body of the mushroom. These protrusions allow the organism to reproduce sexually, typically with itself, and it's still a sporic process, but this is unique to Basidium mycetes, as most fungi go through this process internally, meaning that instead of the spores that sort of the surface of the fungi, on this fungi, the spores grow outward so that they're available to reproduce for others in the community, or on themselves, they can travel from one location to another. However, in other fungi, they grow internally so they can only reproduce within themselves, and there's no transfer interaction between the community. So the species that we're looking at specifically is Agaricus bisporus, and the name Agaricus comes from the Latin word agar, which means filled, and this references where this organism can be found. It's often found in grassy areas, grasslands, places with a lot of available nutrients, and just an open area where this fungi can grow. And the bisporus name comes from the fact that it produces two spores per reproductive cycle, and this is by the Latin prefix bi, meaning two. So here's some images. I went to the grocery store to take these. I've seen these in my yard before, but it's typically during the summer. And right now it's the spring. So in order to get a selfie, I took a trip over to Whole Foods. And these are all the same, but Agaricus bisporus. And I just wanted to kind of make that point that your portobello mushroom caps or stuffed mushroom caps, and you can see my selfie here with all of these different types of mushroom, are all the same species. They're just different variants that are grown for humans to have a variety. And they're grown, the main difference is based off of the species of bacteria that they're grown on. And this is because mushrooms, specifically the species bisporus, are grown on different bacteria. And some are grown on E. coli, some are grown on bacteria that broke apart manure, and they feed off of that. So they're secondary decomposers. They're always in the second round, and based off of what they were grown on, that's what gives them their different flavor. You can still tell that these organisms are, in fact, in the phylum that we're talking about, because you can see the little bumps on their surface. Here there's an indentation where a spore was probably released. It was taken from the top of the mushroom and flown or flew off or traveled to another location through some natural process. And then here you can see these mushrooms were probably harvested right as their tops and their spores were developing. You can tell by the differentiation going on the surface where you have these large protrusions growing, where you could tell these spores were eventually going to develop and grow and spread so that they could proliferate. And as you can see, there's spores over on this side and over on this side, so they could actually proliferate and reproduce within one another and within their community. So their mode of nutrition is it gains its carbon and energy by decomposing the decomposed materials of other organisms, meaning they're secondary decomposers. So to give you an example of this, say you have the organism we talked about previously, the lichen, and the lichen decomposes a dead bacteria, a deceased microorganism. Well, then the Agaricus bisporus will come along and decompose the lichen that had died in the process of decomposing the microorganism, or it would decompose the nutrients that were released from that microorganism's decay. So they're secondary decomposers. They're never the first ones on the scene. They're always kind of there to clean up after the cleanup crew. And they must grow on a food source of some kind, typically one with plenty of decaying organic matter. This goes back to kind of what I said about only being able to find these mushrooms in my area in the summer. When the trees are wet, there's a lot more rain. I live in North Carolina, and say you have a tree stump. They'll grow in the tree stump because there's plenty of nutrients from the decaying tree, but also the tree's absorbing water from the frequent summer rains. So these habitats include humus and soil. Anything with rich microbial life is functional. It doesn't have to be a place where there's plenty of earthworms and birds. Microbes do the job well. And these organisms are chemoheterotrophs, meaning they intake carbon energy via the consumption of other organisms, which they can then convert into usable forms themselves through cellular respiration, photosynthesis, Krebs cycle, glycolysis, all of the processes that we experience as well. And fungi are essential to their environment because of their secretion of the enzymes. And they secrete these enzymes into the soil that decompose organisms. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. They clean up behind the cleanup crew. So say the primary decomposer comes through and they decompose most of an organism, but they leave, you could say, the insides or the exoskeleton. Well, then Agaricus bisporus is going to come along and it's going to say, okay, well, I'm going to decompose what you left behind and completely restart the nutrient cycle so that there's not a little bit of waste every time an organism dies, because otherwise we'd run out of nutrients very, very quickly. So the mode of reproduction is, again, sporic reproduction. I've covered this in several other videos, but basically what happens is the organism goes through mitosis several times. It develops a large number of diploid cells, and then these cells go through meiosis where they split into haploid cells, and then they're distributed. So that's that spore breaking off where we saw the indentation into the one stuffed mushroom cap, or the spores that were developing in the portabella caps. When these things grow like they were in the portabella and then break off like they did in the mushroom cap, it results in them being able to sexually reproduce with one another, because even though they asexually reproduce, they went through meiosis, that gamete is still, that haploid, is still able to travel from one mushroom to another with genetic information, even if it's just from one side to the other, and create a genetically unique individual, which really helps this organism to be able to survive. And this is the life cycle of these organisms, and their spores, interestingly enough, are actually parasitic, which means that their child, their spore, their genetic information leaches off of them through a placenta, deep tissue cells that are then released as an appendage when the spore itself breaks off. And so their life cycle is to grow, to reproduce. If the spore does not kill them in the process of reproducing, they'll do it again until one does. The source, range, and distribution. This sample of Agaricus bisporus was found in Greensboro, North Carolina, and this organism is found internationally, specifically in North America, Ireland, mainland Europe, and any grasslands. So you're not going to find it in the Sahara Desert, you're not going to find it out west in Utah, but you will find it anywhere where there's plenty of grass, plenty of rain, and plenty of open space for this organism to grow. And there are some farms where this organism is grown artificially because it's so common in the United States, but these aren't accounted for in my calculations because these can be artificially designed, and that's not wild. That's not what we as biologists want to study and learn about. The distribution of Agaricus bisporus is clumped because the mushrooms grow well in select areas, but they would not grow at all in other areas. So they're very selective about their environment and where they're able to flourish. And here's their habitat. So it grows best in moist and shady locations that contain large amounts of dying organic matter. That's plenty of food for the primary and then plenty of food for the secondary, which is Agaricus bisporus. And keep in mind that plenty of food for the primary consumer is this highlighter, and then plenty of food for our organism is they get this much. So it's following that 10% rule. So we have to be very aware that they have to have a very, very plentiful source of food. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to survive because they're cleaning up after somebody. And so this includes most grasslands where they're commonly found, and they form rings to kind of help them survive. So as I'm sure can be inferred, but I'll still kind of explain a little bit, they form these rings so that when they go through sporic meiosis, they can kind of cross over, share genetic information with each other, and advance their natural selection much more quickly than they'd be able to if they went through asexual reproduction. Another benefit of this is that they're able to kind of isolate those nutrients, and say another fungus wants to get in and get on their secondary nutrients, they can say, no, this is our circle, you can't come in here. So it's very much about surviving, creating an environment for the next generation to survive, and sharing genetic traits. The primary ecological role of this organism is a fungus that decomposes other organisms. Its job is to decompose and to secrete enzymes that will help to further the decomposition process and the nutrient cycle. And these organisms provide a habitat for other organisms that facilitates growth of the entire ecosystem. So for example, the mushrooms might first attract bugs, and these bugs will then attract lizards and birds and then their predators and so on and so forth. So even though they're just a small mushroom that's just hanging out, they can still attract their own predators, which will then in turn predator will actually spread their genetic information and help them proliferate. So more predators will start to appear in the area and an entire ecosystem can be born. Here's my references. Thank you for watching. I hope that you were able to learn something, and I hope that my video was well informed.